England, of course, has a very different tradition. Another great member of one of the Inns of Court, I think it's Lincoln's Inn, isn't it, Sir John Fortescue, in the governance of England, boasts that an essential guarantor of English freedom is English lawlessness, taking a very different line from the one that I'm doing. And indeed, for much of the period, the very weakness of English law enforcement with the petty constable and so on, who is always a local bod, usually a rather retarded local bod. If you look at the, what times don't change really, do you? But if you actually look in Shakespeare, the law enforcement officer is invariably the buffoon and the fool, the bomb bailiff, and all the rest of it. But by the time that partly in the great movements within London and the London magistrature, and we'll talk about magistrature again in the 18th century, and above all, because of the, planes do have consequences. And partly because, of course, of the enormous growth, even beyond the 18th century, of early 19th century London, you get Peel and the creation of the Peelers and the police force. But ladies and gentlemen, that early police force was consciously designed to be ridiculous. It was given a uniform that was as preposterous as it could. There was a kind of national competition to make, police constable's helmet was the most impractical object that anybody could devise, and the furthest possible thing from what? Military dress. And the powers of a police constable, as again I needn't tell you, mostly are, as it were, derived from very, very ancient common law principles. They are not the result of a paramilitary organization drafted in from the center, or, ladies and gentlemen, before Ian Blair, they didn't used to be. And the militarization of our police, the conscious term, us civilians, the talk of civilian police officers, the creation of this mysterious ethos capped by that strange organization called APCO or whatever it is, all seems to me to be profoundly worrying and to be profoundly alien to the English tradition. And of course, much of the explanation for it is that great god, that god of Baal and Moloch, security, that deadly, deadly thing. So, traditionally then, the police, or the way law was administered, was very, very different in the two cultures. And of course, the way law is administered also in terms of the judge himself. The idea of a magistrate, the idea of a representative of a local community, admittedly, until very recently, class determined. Let us not, make any bones about this. But as it were, the local judge, who is a representative of his community, lightly advised by a professional lawyer, is again part of this sense of law, not simply as a possession, as a national possession, but law also as a local possession. And similarly, the dominant role of the jury in the English system is also part of this. And of course, originally going vastly beyond what we have. We just have what in historical terms is known as the petty jury. That's to say the actual trial jury. Originally, in America, which of course has preserved so much more of this structure than we've done, in America, you have the grand jury, which originally found that there was a true indictment, in other words, an indictment that was worth pursuing, or in the earlier stages, was itself part of a process of investigation, actually presenting what crimes and so on had been committed in the locality. So law then, at every level, in terms of how it's enacted, how it's administered, how it's enforced, and how verdicts are arrived at, is seen in this tradition, as opposed to the Roman tradition, as a common, even a popular possession. And this also has very, very important consequences in one or two other areas, particularly the method of trial. The preference of English law for fact, the preference of English law for evidence, produces a very unusual system of justice. It does not depend on the use of torture. All Roman criminal law depends on the use of torture. One of the most truly shocking rooms in Europe is to be found in Salzburg. And we all go to Salzburg for exquisite Mozart festivals. And we admire the pretty little Baroque twiddles and the tiny squares and the sweet Austrian way that they have with children and gypsies and all the rest of it, and Mozart's balls and so on. But ladies and gentlemen, can I suggest when you do go to the Mozart Festival in Salzburg, you visit the bishop's castle. The bishop is, of course, the Prince Bishop, is, of course, Mozart's first patron. And it's a very handsome castle, heavily refurbished in the middle of the 18th century. So it's got lots of Rococo flourishes, complete with a Rococo torture chamber. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we all think, and the tower, of course, illustrates this fact rather wonderfully, we all think of torture chambers as dripping medieval vaults with huge hulking creatures, the whole thing vaguely sadomasochistic and whatever, and done in the kind of decency of obscurity and guttering torches and that kind of thing. Not a bit of it. Go to Salzburg. It's at the very top of the building. It has huge, elegant, neo-Gothic windows. Pretty little twiddles. And then all the apparatus is still in position. All the various racks and instruments, which again have the sort of decoration that, Liberace had on his candlestick on the piano, again, little twiddles. And, the Rococo is sort of slightly off key like that. And what's even better, ladies and gentlemen, it's still complete with the instructions. I imagine they came jolly useful in the last war. And over each one of them, again, in a pretty little Rococo frame, you've got suspect with clothes on, suspects with clothes off, arm in position 1, 2, 3, wrenched, torn out, broken. That is numbered. The French for torture is la question, the question. And in immediately before, right up to the revolution, the way in which what the examining magistrate was the magistrate who examined you whilst you were under torture. And at each stage of the legal process, he made a notation in the margin, 1, 2, or 3. The normal torture was la botte, and that was simply a fixed plank and a mobile plank and 3 wedges. One was 1 wedge, painful, a bit bruising, not too bad, gets the soft lads, duff people up. 2, 3, smashes the lower leg. And it was done in every case for a non-noble. Now, we may reflect on this as modern squeamishness. After all, the English were not exactly backwards at coming forwards when it came to penalties. Hanging, drawing, and quartering, which we all it trips off the tongue rather nicely, doesn't it? There's a very famous incident when the poor little Portuguese physician was framed for having poisoned Elizabeth, and it was decided that there had to be some especially exemplary punishment inflicted on him. And in typical fashion, Burghley, who really I think in some ways is much more a product of that expert tradition of government than us, goes to the physicians and says, can they come up with a peculiarly horrible method of execution? And the Royal College meets in solemn session and advises him, sir, my lord, I'm sorry, he's a peer by this time, my lord, done properly, it is inconceivable to think of anything more painful than hanging, drawing, and quartering. So, but that is a penalty. That is after conviction. And what is quite striking is that the first serious, fundamental European attack within Europe on the use of torture is written by an English Secretary of State. It's John Smith in the De Republica Anglorum. And Smith knew what he was talking about, because of course Smith was Secretary of State in this brief period when the English do use torture